The Wyoming night pressed down heavy and black, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and turned every shadow into a threat. Through the pine forest, a single horse and rider cut through the silence like a knife through silk. The woman wore a dark coat that blended with the night, her face hidden beneath a wool scarf pulled tight against the cold. Behind her, the thunder of pursuit. 6 riders, maybe 7, their horses' hooves pounding the frozen ground in savage rhythm. Gunshots cracked through the trees, splitting the air with violence. One bullet kissed the bark of a pine 3 feet from her head. Another whistled past her shoulder close enough that she felt its heat. Grace Hollister didn't flinch. She leaned low over her horse's neck, her body moving in perfect harmony with the animal's stride. Her breathing stayed even controlled. 15 years ago, in a different life, she had learned that panic killed faster than bullets ever could. The wilderness blurred past trees, becoming dark streaks in her peripheral vision. Then, without warning, Grace pulled hard on the reins. The horse planted its hooves and pivoted 180 degrees in a move that would have thrown most riders. Grace stayed centered, balanced, already reaching for the Winchester rifle strapped to her saddle. The weapon came up smooth and natural, an extension of her arm rather than a tool she carried. The pursuing riders came around the bend expecting to see their quarry fleeing. Instead, they found her facing them, rifle-raised eyes cold as winter steel in the moonlight. Grace fired. The first shot knocked a rifle clean out of a rider's hands before he could aim. The second caught another man's gun belt, spinning him sideways in his saddle. Third shot, 4th, 5th, 6th. 4 seconds of controlled chaos. Not a single bullet found flesh, but every one found its mark. Guns flew from hands, saddle straps, severed reins cut. The riders scattered in confusion, their horses panicking as their masters lost control. Grace worked the Winchester's lever action with mechanical precision, each movement economical and exact. Shell casings arced through the air, catching moonlight as they fell. Smoke curled from the barrel like breath in the cold. When the echo of the last shot faded, 6 men sat on the ground or clung to their horses, disarmed and demoralized. None were dead, none were even bleeding, but all of them understood they had just met something beyond their experience. Grace lowered the rifle, but kept it ready. Her voice cut through the night, quiet but carrying. "Tell your boss Grace Hollister doesn't run anymore." She didn't wait for a response. A touch of her heel sent her horse wheeling around, and she disappeared back into the darkness, leaving the men to pick up their weapons and their dignity. The screen went black. White letters appeared 72 hours earlier. The sun rose over Iron Ridge Ranch with the kind of golden light that made even hardship look beautiful. 800 acres of Wyoming grassland stretched out beneath the Bighorn Mountains, the land rolling and wild and unforgiving. The ranch house stood weathered but solid, built from timber and stone by hands that understood the country. On the porch, Grace Hollister stood with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. At 42, she carried herself with a stillness that some people mistook for weakness. They were wrong. Her frame was lean from hard work, her hands calloused from rope and leather and rifle. Dark hair pulled back severe from a face that had once been called beautiful, but now seemed carved from something harder than beauty. Eyes the color of winter sky watched the horizon with the patience of someone who had learned to wait. The screen door banged open behind her. "You planning to stand there all morning, or are we actually going to talk about this?" Emma Tate stood in the doorway, 17 years old, and burning with the kind of anger only youth could sustain. She had her father's dark hair and sharp features, but her eyes carried a hardness that didn't come from genetics. That came from losing a parent and blaming the one who remained. Grace didn't turn around. "There's coffee on the stove." "I don't want coffee, I want answers." "About what, Emma? About why you're planning to get yourself killed over 200 cows." Grace took a slow sip from her cup, buying time she didn't need. The conversation had been coming for days, circling like a hawk over prey. She had hoped to delay it a little longer. Hope she had learned was often disappointed. "The cattle are all we have left," Grace said. "Your father spent 5 years building that herd." "I'm not handing it over to Victor Kane because he waves a piece of paper and makes threats." Emma crossed her arms, her jaw set in that stubborn line Grace had come to know too well. Dad's dead. The ranch doesn't matter anymore. Your father died trying to protect this place. That makes it matter. He died in an accident. Emma's voice carried an edge like broken glass. His wagon flipped on the road to town. Or is there another version you'd like to tell me? The question hung between them, loaded with suspicion and grief. Grace finally turned to face the girl who had never once called her mother, would probably never call her mother, and maybe didn't owe her that kindness anyway. Your father's death was no accident, Grace said quietly, but that's a conversation for another time. No. Emma stepped forward, her hands balling into fists. That's a conversation for right now. You owe me the truth. Before Grace could respond, the sound of horses interrupted them. Both women turned toward the main road, watching as dust rose in the distance. Not the single rider of a neighbor stopping by. This was a group moving with purpose. Grace set down her coffee cup. Her hand moved to the Winchester, leaning against the porch rail, fingers wrapping around the stock with familiar ease. Emma noticed the movement, noticed how Grace's whole body shifted into something alert and dangerous. "Who is it?" Emma asked. "The man your father refused to sell to," Grace said. "The man who owns half of Wyoming and wants the other half." 12 riders crested the rise and approached the ranch at an easy walk. They spread out as they came, a show of force disguised as casual movement. Men with hard faces and guns worn easy on their hips. The kind of men who did violence for money and slept well afterward. At their head rode Victor Kane. He sat his horse like a man who had never been told no and wouldn't recognize the word if he heard it. 50 years old, broad across the shoulders with silver threading through dark hair, and a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his eyes. He wore good clothes, Eastern tailored, that looked out of place in the rough country but sent a message. I have money. I have power. I have everything except what I want. And what he wanted, Grace knew, was everything she had left. Kane reined in 20 feet from the porch. His men fanned out behind him, hands resting casual near their weapons, a show of overwhelming force, a reminder that resistance was futile. "Mrs. Hollister," Kane touched the brim of his hat, a mockery of courtesy. "I hope I'm not interrupting your morning." "You are," Grace said, "but I suspect you don't care." Kane smiled without warmth. "Direct. I appreciate that. Saves time." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "I have here a promissory note signed by your late husband, $10,000 borrowed 13 months ago to purchase breeding stock from a ranch in Montana. The note came due 30 days ago. I've been patient, but patience has limits." "My husband died 8 months ago," Grace said. "I wasn't aware of any outstanding debts." "Ignorance doesn't erase obligation." Kane leaned forward in his saddle. "The note is legal and binding. I'm prepared to offer you 2 options. First, you sell me Iron Ridge for $2,000. That won't cover the debt, but I'm feeling generous. And the second option," something shifted in Kane's expression, something that made Grace's skin crawl. "Marry me. The debt disappears, the ranch stays in your name, and you gain the protection of a man who can ensure nothing else. Unfortunate happens to you or the girl." Emma made a sound like a strangled gasp. Grace didn't react at all, her face carved from stone. "Those are interesting options," Grace said. "Here's mine. I drive my cattle to Cheyenne, sell them for fair market value, and pay you what's owed with interest." Kane's smile widened. "The road to Cheyenne passes through territory I control. 4 herds have tried that route this season. None of them arrived. Bandits, accidents, natural disasters. The frontier is a dangerous place, Mrs. Hollister. I've noticed. Have you also noticed that you're a woman alone with a teenage girl and a handful of ranch hands, that you have no legal recourse, no powerful friends, and no realistic chance of success?" Kane sat back. "I'm offering you a way out. Take it while the offer stands." Grace raised the Winchester, not pointing it at anyone, but making it clear she could. The movement was so smooth and sudden that 3 of Kane's men reached for their guns before forcing themselves to stop. "I have 7 days until your supposed debt comes due," Grace said. "In that time, I suggest you stay off my land. If I see you or your men on Iron Ridge property again before then, I'll consider it trespassing. I defend my property." Kane studied her for a long moment. Then he laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. "You have fire. I can see why Thomas married you, even if you weren't from around here." He leaned forward again. "But fire burns out Mrs. Hollister, and when it does, I'll still be here." He wheeled his horse around his men, falling in behind him. They rode back toward the main road, dust rising in their wake. Grace didn't lower the rifle until they disappeared over the rise. Emma stood frozen, her face white. "What just happened?" "Victor Kane just showed us his hand," Grace said. "Now we know what we're facing. He threatened us." "He did. And you threatened him back." "I did." Emma shook her head. "You're insane. He has a dozen men. We have you, me, and Macon. How exactly do you plan to win this?" Grace finally lowered the Winchester. "By being better than him where it counts." "And where's that?" Grace looked at the girl she had tried to raise, the girl who saw her as a stranger wearing the title of stepmother like an ill-fitting coat. "You'll see." That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The conversation with Kane kept playing in her mind, mixed with questions she had been avoiding for 8 months. How did her father really die? Why had Grace never seemed surprised by his death, only resigned? What was the woman hiding? Emma rose from bed and dressed quietly. The ranch house creaked and settled around her, familiar sounds that usually brought comfort. Tonight, they only emphasized how alone she felt. She moved down the hallway past Grace's closed door, stopped, turned back. The door wasn't locked. Emma pushed it open slowly, wincing at every small sound. Inside, the room was dark and empty. Moonlight through the window showed a made bed, a simple dresser, a trunk in the corner. Grace's room held almost nothing personal, as if the woman who slept there expected to leave at any moment. Emma crossed to the trunk. Old, battered, secured with a brass lock that looked more serious than anything else in the room. She picked up a hairpin from the dresser, worked it into the lock. Her father had taught her this years ago when she got locked out of her own room. The memory hurt. The lock clicked open. Inside the trunk, beneath a layer of plain clothes, Emma found things that made no sense. A poster, faded and creased, showing a woman in elaborate frontier costume. The woman held 2 revolvers and wore a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Above her, bold letters proclaimed, "Steady Grace, the Dead-Eye Lady. Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show." The woman in the poster looked younger but unmistakable. It was Grace. Emma's hands shook as she dug deeper. A wanted poster official, and serious with a different name. Grace Morgan wanted for murder reward $5,000. The likeness was crude but clear enough. The same face, 15 years younger, stared back with hollow eyes. A letter written in careful script on yellowed paper. Emma unfolded it with trembling fingers. "Grace, I know what you had to do to survive. I know what Silas did to you, the marks he left on your body and soul. You are not a murderer, daughter. You are a survivor. God forgives you. I forgive you. Find somewhere safe and build a new life. You deserve peace. With all my love, Mother." The letter was dated 15 years ago, postmarked from a town Emma had never heard of in Missouri. The sound of boots on the porch made Emma jump. She shoved everything back into the trunk, closed the lid, tried to reset the lock. Her hands fumbled. The lock wouldn't catch. Footsteps in the hallway. Emma abandoned the trunk and pressed herself against the wall beside the door, heart hammering. The footsteps passed by, continued to the kitchen, water running, the soft clink of a cup. Emma slipped out of the room and down the hallway. She made it to her own door, closed it quietly, and leaned against it as her heart tried to break through her ribs. Grace Hollister was not Grace Hollister. She was Grace Morgan, a wanted murderer, a woman who had killed someone named Silas and fled west to hide. And Emma's father had married her, had died 8 months after refusing to sell to Victor Kane, had died in an accident that Grace claimed was no accident. Emma pressed her hands over her mouth to keep from screaming. The sun rose on another day of hard choices. Grace stood in the barn, checking the harnesses and supplies they would need for the cattle drive to Cheyenne. 150 miles through country that would kill you if you weren't careful and kill you faster if you were unlucky. She had made the journey twice before with Thomas back when he was alive, and things seemed simpler. Nothing was simple anymore. The barn door opened. Macon Reed stepped inside, moving with the careful gait of a man who had learned to compensate for missing pieces. His left arm ended just below the elbow, the empty sleeve pinned up neat and practical. 55 years old, weathered by sun and hardship, with eyes that had seen too much war and not enough peace. "We need to talk," Macon said. Grace continued checking a bridle strap. "About what? About the fact that you're planning to drive 200 head of cattle through territory controlled by a man who wants you dead." Macon crossed to where she worked. "About the fact that you have 3 people who can shoot, and one of them is a girl who's never fired a gun in anger." "Then we'll have to be smart instead of numerous." Macon was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight. "How long have you known that I recognized you?" Grace's hand stilled on the leather. She didn't look up. "Since the first week I arrived at Iron Ridge, you watched me handle a rifle and your face changed. You knew." "I worked security for Buffalo Bill's show for 2 seasons, Macon said. "Watched you perform probably 50 times. You were the best I ever saw. Still are, based on what the boys told me about your little demonstration with the targets last week. That was practice." "Practice for what?" Grace finally looked at him. "For keeping Emma and Josiah alive when Cain comes for us." Macon nodded slowly. "I figured, which is why I'm asking you straight. Grace Morgan killed a man named Silas Garrett in Missouri 15 years ago. Was it self-defense, or are you actually a murderer?" The question hung in the dusty air between them. Grace set down the bridle and turned to face him fully. "Silas Garrett was my manager with the Wild West show. He was also the man who beat me unconscious twice a month for 3 years. The night I killed him, he came at me with a knife. I shot him. He died. I ran. That's self-defense. Not according to Missouri law. Silas had money, had connections. His family had the murder charge filed before I made it out of the state." Grace's voice stayed flat, emotionless. "I've been running ever since, until I met Thomas. Did Thomas know?" "He knew I was hiding from something. I told him enough." Grace looked away. "He offered me a bargain. He needed a wife to help run the ranch and give his children a mother figure. I needed a new identity and a safe place. We agreed to help each other." "Did you love him?" Grace was quiet for a long time. "I learned to. Not the way he deserved, maybe. But I tried." Macon picked up a coil of rope, tested its strength out of habit. "I killed 42 men during the war. Shot them, stabbed them, beat one to death with my rifle when the ammunition ran out. I can still see some of their faces." He looked at Grace. "Nobody calls me a murderer. They call me a veteran. The reason makes the difference. You had a uniform and orders. You had a man with a knife who'd already proven he'd hurt you." Macon set down the rope. "Far as I'm concerned, you did what you had to do to survive. That's not murder. That's justice when the law won't provide it." "The law would disagree. The law isn't always right." Macon moved toward the door, then stopped. "I'm going with you to Cheyenne. Not because I owe Thomas, though I did respect the man. I'm going because everyone deserves a chance to stand up for what's theirs. You've earned that chance." After Macon left, Grace stood alone in the barn. The conversation had opened something in her chest, a tightness she hadn't realized she was carrying. Someone knew the truth and didn't condemn her. The feeling was strange, almost painful in its unfamiliarity. As the sun climbed higher, the small group from Iron Ridge Ranch began their journey toward Cheyenne. 200 head of cattle, 4 riders, and determination that would have to substitute for overwhelming force. Grace Hollister, who used to be Grace Morgan, who used to be Steady Grace, the dead-eye performer, rode at the front. Her Winchester rested across her saddle, familiar as breathing. Behind her came Emma, learning to see her as something other than an enemy. Josiah, learning that truth was more complicated than anger, and Macon, who believed in second chances. None of them spoke about the odds they faced. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. 4 against 40 or more across 150 miles of hostile territory, with a deadline that ticked closer every hour. But they rode anyway. Because sometimes you fought not because you could win, but because losing without fighting was worse than death. The Wyoming sun beat down on their backs as Iron Ridge Ranch disappeared behind them. Ahead lay Devil's Crossing, Victor Kane's Trap, and whatever ending waited at the road's end. Grace touched the rifle stock, once a gesture of reassurance or prayer. The woman who couldn't die was done running. Now came the reckoning. The cattle moved like a river of hide and horn through the narrow canyon, 200 animals driven by voices and will across land that didn't care whether they lived or died. Grace rode point, her eyes scanning the rock walls that rose steep on either side. Behind her, Macon kept the middle of the herd moving steady. Josiah and Emma worked the flanks, their horses dancing nervous as the canyon walls closed in. This was the second day of the drive. They had made good time crossing the open grassland, but now the terrain forced them into passages that made Grace's instincts scream warnings she couldn't quite name. Widow's Canyon earned its name honestly. 3 years ago, a family attempting to move their herd through this cut had been caught in a flash flood. The water came down the canyon like God's own hammer, sweeping away cattle wagons and people with equal indifference. They found the husband's body 2 miles downstream. His wife and children were never found at all. Today, the sky stretched blue and cloudless, no threat of rain. But water wasn't the only danger that haunted narrow places. Grace raised her hand, bringing the column to a halt. The cattle bunched together, lowing their confusion and displeasure. Macon rode forward to join her. "What is it?" he asked quietly. "Look at the rim." Grace pointed with her chin toward the top of the canyon walls. "See that reflection?" Macon squinted against the sun. After a moment, he nodded. "Metal. Rifle barrel, maybe." "Maybe." Grace's hand moved to her Winchester, drawing it slow and smooth from the saddle scabbard. "Or definitely." The attack came with brutal suddenness. 12 men rose from concealment along both canyon rims, rifles already aimed and ready. The first volley of shots cracked through the air like thunder, kicking up dirt and stone around the cattle. The herd panicked instantly, animals scattering and bellowing in terror. "Get down!" Grace shouted. Emma threw herself from her saddle, landing hard behind a boulder. Josiah wheeled his horse, trying to control the stampeding cattle while drawing his pistol. Macon's rifle came up fast despite his missing arm. The weapon braced against his body in a carry he had practiced 10,000 times. Grace assessed the situation in seconds. 12 shooters, high ground, clear lines of fire. Her people were exposed and outnumbered. The cattle were scattering into side ravines where they would be impossible to recover. This wasn't a robbery. This was an execution disguised as an ambush. She made her choice. Grace spurred her horse toward a pile of fallen rock that offered both height and cover. Her mount took the obstacle in one powerful leap, hooves striking stone and finding purchase. At the top, Grace swung down from the saddle in a single fluid motion, bringing the Winchester to her shoulder as her boots hit ground. The men on the rim expected return fire from below, anticipated their targets cowering behind inadequate cover. They didn't expect someone to gain elevation and turn their advantage against them. Grace's Winchester spoke in a rhythm only she could hear. The first shot struck a rifle stock, splintering wood and sending the weapon spinning from nerveless fingers. Before the gunman could react, she had already cycled the lever-action muscle memory from 1,000 performances, making the motion smooth as silk. A second muzzle flash. The bullet caught a gun belt heavy buckle, deflecting the round, but the impact spinning the man sideways. He stumbled, lost his balance on the narrow rim, and fell. Grace didn't watch him hit. Her eyes had already found the next threat. 3 more shots followed in rapid succession, each round finding its mark with mathematical precision. Not killing shots, Grace didn't aim for flesh. She targeted weapons, equipment, anything that would disarm and demoralize without taking lives. A canteen exploded in a spray of water. A saddle strap parted, sending a man sliding off his horse. A rifle sight shattered, filling a gunman's eyes with metal fragments that sent him screaming. 6 shots, 7, 8. 12 seconds had passed since the ambush began. 8 of the 12 attackers were out of the fight, their weapons destroyed or their positions untenable. The remaining 4 hesitated, confused by the sudden reversal of fortune. That hesitation cost them. Macon opened fire from below, his shots carefully placed to drive the gunman back from the rim. Josiah had gained control of his panicked horse and added his pistol to the barrage, forcing one attacker to abandon his position entirely. The ambush collapsed. The surviving gunmen retreated, scrambling back from the canyon edge and running for their horses. Within moments, the sound of hoofbeats echoed as they fled north, leaving behind their wounded and their dead. Grace lowered the Winchester, breathing steady despite the adrenaline singing through her veins. Smoke curled from the barrel. The familiar smell of gunpowder brought back memories of performance rings and cheering crowds, a different life where shooting meant spectacle rather than survival. Grace, Emma's voice high and frightened. Josiah's hit, the words cut through Grace's focus like a knife. She vaulted down from the rocks, hitting the ground running. Emma knelt beside her brother, her hands pressed against his left shoulder, where blood welled dark and steady between her fingers. Josiah sat propped against a boulder, his face pale and sweating. His right hand clutched his pistol, knuckles white. When he saw Grace approaching, something defiant flickered in his eyes even through the pain. "How bad?" Grace dropped to her knees beside them, already pulling medical supplies from her saddlebag. "Went clean through," Josiah managed through gritted teeth. "Front and back. Missed the bone, I think." Grace peeled Emma's hands away gently and examined the wound. Entry hole in the front of his shoulder exit, wound in back, blood flowing but not spurting. No arterial damage. The bullet had passed through muscle and soft tissue without hitting anything immediately fatal. "You're lucky," Grace said. She pulled out a bottle of whiskey and a clean cloth. "This is going to hurt." "Everything already hurts." Josiah tried to smile and failed. "How much worse can it get?" Grace poured whiskey directly into the wound. Josiah's scream echoed off the canyon walls, his body going rigid with agony. Emma held him steady, tears streaming down her face as she whispered reassurances that neither of them believed. Working quickly, Grace packed both wounds with clean cloth soaked in whiskey, then bound his shoulder tight with strips torn from a spare shirt. The bandaging was competent professional. She had learned field medicine during her years with the Wild West show. Performers got hurt regularly, and doctors weren't always available in the remote places where they traveled. "You'll live," Grace told Josiah when she finished. "The wound needs to stay clean and the bleeding needs to stop. You can't ride hard for at least 3 days." "We don't have 3 days." Josiah's voice was weak but stubborn. "Kane's deadline is in 5 days. We're still 80 miles from Cheyenne. Then we'll figure something out." Grace stood and turned to assess the scattered herd. Most of the cattle had run into side ravines spooked by the gunfire. Gathering them would take hours they didn't have. Macon rode up, his face grim. "Lost maybe 30 head. They ran into the deep canyons to the east. We'll never get them back without a full day's work. We leave them." Grace made the decision without hesitation. 170 head should still bring enough to pay Kane's debt. We keep moving. "And if there's another ambush?" Emma asked. She still knelt beside her brother, one hand gripping his good arm like he might disappear if she let go. "Then I'll deal with it the same way I dealt with this one." Grace reloaded her Winchester, her movements automatic. "But now they know what we can do. They'll think twice before trying again." As the sun climbed toward noon, they worked to gather the remaining cattle and get the herd moving again. Josiah insisted on riding despite the pain his jaw set, in a stubborn line that reminded Grace of his father. Emma stayed close to her brother, watching him with frightened eyes. By the time they cleared Widow's Canyon and made camp that evening, exhaustion had settled over all of them like a heavy blanket. They built a small fire and ate cold beans straight from the can, too tired for proper cooking. The cattle grazed nearby, still nervous but settling. Grace sat apart from the others, cleaning her rifle by firelight. The ritual soothed her, the familiar motions of checking the action, running an oiled cloth down the barrel, inspecting each mechanism for wear or damage. Good weapons were the difference between living and dying out here. She had learned that lesson young and never forgotten it. "That was some shooting today." Grace looked up to find Macon standing at the edge of the firelight. The old soldier held a cup of coffee steam rising in the cooling evening air. "Just what needed doing," Grace said. 8 shots in maybe 12 seconds, everyone hitting exactly where you aimed." Macon lowered himself to sit on a nearby rock, moving carefully to accommodate his missing arm. "I watched you perform twice with Buffalo Bill's show. You were good then. You're better now." "Practice. Or necessity." Macon sipped his coffee. "There's a difference between trick shooting for crowds and combat shooting when lives depend on it. You handled that ambush like someone who'd done it before." Grace was quiet, remembering. "Silas used to make me practice combat scenarios. He'd set up moving targets, unpredictable angle situations where I had to shoot fast and accurate under pressure, said it made the regular performances look easy by comparison. He was right about that, at least. He was right about a lot of things. Grace's voice hardened. He just happened to also be a monster. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to coals. Across the camp, Emma was helping Josiah settle into his bedroll, fussing over him like a mother hen. The sight brought a small smile to Grace's face. "She's good with him," Macon observed. "She loves her brother. That kind of love makes you strong when you need to be. You love them too, both of them." Grace's hand stilled on the rifle. "I care about their safety." "That's not what I asked." Grace looked at the old soldier, seeing the understanding in his weathered face. "I don't have the right to love them. I lied to their father. I brought danger to their doorstep. Everything bad that's happened to this family can be traced back to me and my past." "That's guilt talking, not truth." Macon set down his coffee. "Thomas Tate knew exactly who you were when he married you. He made that choice with open eyes. And those kids over there, they're choosing to stand with you now. That counts for something. Or they're just trapped by circumstance." "No," Macon shook his head. "Emma could have gone to Denver to stay with her aunt. Josiah could have sold his share of the ranch and moved on. They're here because family matters to them. And whether you want to admit it or not, you're family." Grace turned her attention to checking the ammunition supplies, counting cartridges, and organizing them for quick access. The mechanical task helped steady her emotions. Family. The word felt foreign in her mouth. For 15 years she had been alone, running hiding building walls to keep everyone at arm's length. The idea that she might actually belong somewhere felt dangerous. Belonging meant having something to lose. "You should talk to Josiah," Macon said, standing with a slight groan. "Boy's been watching you all evening. Got questions written all over his face." After Macon left, Grace sat alone with her thoughts and her rifle. The night deepened around her, stars appearing in the vast Wyoming sky. This country was beautiful in its harshness, unforgiving, but honest. You knew where you stood here. The land would kill you if you made mistakes, but it didn't lie or manipulate or pretend to be something it wasn't. She had learned to love that honesty. Movement at the edge of her vision made Grace look up. Josiah approached slowly, one hand cradling his bandaged shoulder. He moved like an old man, pain evident in every step. "You should be resting," Grace said. "Can't sleep?" Josiah lowered himself to sit across the fire from her, grimacing as the motion pulled his injury. "Too much hurts." "I can give you laudanum for the pain." "No, need to stay sharp." He looked at her across the flames. "In case there's another attack." Grace nodded, understanding. "The pain will ease in a few days. The wound is clean. As long as infection doesn't set in, you'll heal." "You sound sure of that." "I've treated gunshot wounds before, more than I'd like to count." She set aside her rifle, giving him her full attention. "What do you really want to ask me, Josiah?" He was quiet for a long moment, firelight playing across his young face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. "Did you really love my father, or was he just convenient?" The question cut deeper than Grace expected. She could have given him an easy answer, a comfortable lie. But Josiah had earned the truth, had bled for the right to hear it. "When I met your father, I was desperate," Grace began. "I had been running for 7 years, working terrible jobs for terrible pay, always looking over my shoulder, never staying anywhere long enough to build a life. I was tired, Josiah. Tired of being afraid. Tired of being alone." "So he was convenient. Let me finish." Grace's voice carried quiet authority. "Thomas offered me safety in exchange for partnership. A business arrangement, nothing more. I would help him run the ranch and mother his children. He would give me a new name and a legitimate life. We shook hands on it like signing a contract." Josiah's expression darkened, confirming his worst suspicions. "But then something happened I didn't expect," Grace continued. "Your father was kind, not in a showy way, not grand gestures, small kindnesses. He noticed when I was tired and took on extra work without being asked. He remembered I liked my coffee black and made sure there was always a pot hot in the morning. When I had nightmares, he never pried or demanded explanations. He just sat with me until dawn if that's what I needed." She paused, remembering. The memories brought both warmth and ache. 6 months into our marriage, we were mending fence on the north pasture. A storm came up sudden, like they do out here. We took shelter in an old line shack, waiting for it to pass. While we waited, he asked me about my life before. Really asked, not demanding or suspicious, just interested. What did you tell him? Everything. Grace looked into the fire. I told him about growing up in Missouri, about learning to shoot from my father, about joining Buffalo Bill's show. I told him about Silas, about the beatings, about the night I killed him. Every ugly truth I'd been carrying for years, I laid it all out. What did he say? He said, "That must have been terrible. I'm sorry you went through it alone." Grace's voice caught slightly. Then he said, "You're not alone anymore. You're home." The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. Josiah wiped at his eyes with his good hand. "I didn't choose to love him at first," Grace said. "But over time, through shared work and shared hardship and shared quiet moments, I did love him. Real love. The kind that grows slow and roots deep, not passionate like storybooks, but steady, reliable, true." "He loved you too," Josiah said quietly. "I could see it, the way he looked at you when you weren't watching, like you were something precious he couldn't quite believe was real. He was a better man than I deserved." "No?" Josiah shook his head. "He knew exactly what he was getting. You said it yourself, he knew your whole story. He chose you anyway. That means he thought you were worth it." Grace looked at the young man across the fire, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not the angry boy suspicious of his stepmother, but someone trying to understand complicated truths about the father he had lost. "The night before he died," Grace said, "your father showed me Kane's blackmail letter. He told me he was going to the sheriff to confess everything to protect me from Kane's threats. I begged him not to. I said we could sell the ranch, start over somewhere else, run away like I'd always done. But he refused. He said, 'Grace, you've been running your whole life. It's time to stop. It's time to stand and fight for what's yours.' Then he kissed my forehead and said, 'I'm proud of you, not for being the best shot in 3 territories, for being brave enough to try building a real life despite everything.'" Josiah's face crumpled. Tears ran freely now, grief finally finding release after 8 months of being locked behind anger and suspicion. "I miss him so much it hurts worse than this bullet hole." "I know." Grace stood and moved around the fire, sitting beside him. Carefully mindful of his injury, she put her arm around his shoulders. "I miss him too." They sat together in the firelight, stepmother and stepson, united in their grief for a good man taken too soon. Around them, the Wyoming night stretched vast and indifferent. But in that small circle of warmth, something shifted. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. "Grace," Josiah's voice was small, younger than his 19 years. "Do you think he knew that Kane would kill him?" "I think he suspected the risk, and chose to face it anyway because running would have meant losing himself." Grace tightened her arm slightly. "Your father was the bravest man I ever knew, and I will make sure his sacrifice means something. I promise you that." They stayed like that until the fire burned low and exhaustion finally claimed them both. When Emma came to check on her brother and found them sleeping upright, leaning against each other for support, she draped blankets over them both and added wood to the fire. Some things were too fragile to disturb. The 4th day of the drive dawned cold and overcast. Grace woke before sunrise to find their camp surrounded by morning mist, the world reduced to gray shadows and muffled sound. The cattle were restless, sensing something in the air that human senses couldn't detect. Macon was already up checking the horses and scanning the surrounding terrain with the vigilance of a man who had survived too many battles to ever completely relax. "Weather's changing," he said when Grace joined him. "Storm coming maybe by tonight. Can we make Devil's Crossing before it hits? If we push hard. But Josiah's not fit for hard riding yet." Grace considered their options. Devil's Crossing was still 40 miles ahead, the narrow bridge Luther had warned them about. If they rushed and exhausted themselves, they would arrive unprepared for whatever ambush Kane had planned. If they delayed, the storm might trap them in open country with the herd scattering and no shelter. "We maintain steady pace," Grace decided. "Get to the crossing tomorrow morning when we're fresh and alert. And tonight, we find defensible ground and weather the storm if it comes." They broke camp efficiently, everyone moving with the practiced coordination of people who had learned to work together. Josiah rode, despite obvious pain, his jaw clenched against discomfort. Emma stayed close to her brother, watching him with worried eyes that rarely left his face. The herd moved sluggish under the gray sky, cattle, sensing the approaching storm and growing difficult to manage. Grace rode point, her eyes constantly scanning for threats, both human and natural. The land here was more broken cut with ravines and studded with rock formations that could hide a dozen ambushes. They were approaching a narrow defile between two ridges when Grace spotted movement. A single rider approaching from the east at an easy lope, not attacking, not fleeing, just riding openly toward them. Grace raised her hand, halting the column. Her rifle came out smooth and ready. Macon moved to her side, his weapon likewise prepared. Emma and Josiah held the herd while the two experienced shooters faced the approaching stranger. As the rider drew closer, Grace felt recognition click into place. Luther Payne sat his horse with easy confidence, hands visible and empty of weapons. He stopped 30 yards out, respecting the distance of cautious guns. "Grace," Luther called, "I need to talk, alone if possible." "Anything you say can be heard by all of us," Grace replied. "We don't keep secrets." Luther glanced at the others, then nodded acceptance. He walked his horse closer, stopping just outside easy rifle range. Smart. He knew Grace's capabilities. "Kane knows you're coming," Luther said without preamble. "Has 20 men set up at Devil's Crossing with rifles, dynamite, and orders to stop you by any means necessary." Grace's jaw tightened. She had suspected as much. How many exactly? After yesterday's ambush at Widow's Canyon, he doubled his forces. Luther's expression was grim. Now there are 40 men waiting. He's not taking any chances. Macon swore quietly. Emma's face went white. Even Josiah looked shaken by the numbers. 40 men, Grace repeated, her voice flat. "And how many of those will you be able to neutralize from inside?" "Me." Luther looked surprised. "I'm not going back to Kane's camp." "Why not?" Luther dismounted, moving slowly to show he meant no threat. He walked forward until he stood in easy talking distance, his hands loose at his sides. His face carried the weight of old shame and recent decisions. "Because 15 years ago, I made a choice that destroyed your life," Luther said, "and I need to finally tell you the truth about that night." The world seemed a contract narrowing to just Grace and Luther, and the words hovering unspoken between them. Behind Grace, she heard Emma and Josiah moving closer, drawn by the intensity of the moment. "What truth?" Grace asked, though part of her already knew, had known for years, but refused to acknowledge. Luther took a deep breath. "The night you shot Silas Garrett, I was there. Not in the tent, but close. I heard the argument, heard him threaten. You heard the gunshot. You never came forward, never testified. Because I was a coward. But that's not all." Luther's hands clenched and unclenched, the only sign of his agitation. "After you ran, I went into the tent. Silas was still alive, Grace. Bleeding bad, but alive. He was conscious enough to talk, to beg for help." Grace felt the ground shift beneath her. "What did you do?" "I stood there and watched him die." Luther's voice cracked. "I could have called for a doctor. The show's surgeon was maybe 2 minutes away. Silas would probably have survived if I'd gotten help immediately, but I didn't. I stood there and I watched the light go out of his eyes because I thought he deserved it for what he'd done to you." The confession hung in the air like smoke. "So you let him die," Grace said slowly. "You made the choice not to save him." "Yes. And then you let me believe I was a murderer, let me run for 15 years hiding and afraid, thinking I had taken a life." "Yes." Luther's face showed naked anguish. "I told myself I was protecting you, that your shooting him was self-defense and his death was just karma. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. If I'd called the doctor, I would have had to explain why I was there, what I'd seen. I would have been connected to his death. So I chose the coward's path. I let you take all the blame." Grace stared at him, her mind reeling. 15 years of guilt, 15 years of running, 15 years of believing she was a killer. All built on a foundation of one young man's cowardice. "Who's the real murderer here?" Grace asked, her voice deadly quiet. "The woman who shot in self-defense, or the man who stood by and let the victim bleed out when he could have been saved. Both of us, maybe. Or neither. I don't know anymore. Luther met her eyes. But I do know that I owe you a debt I can never repay. So I'm here to try. Let me help you fight Cain. Let me do something right for once in my miserable life. Josiah pushed forward his good hand on his pistol. How do we know this isn't a trap? How do we know Cain didn't send you to feed us false information? You don't, Luther admitted. But ask yourself this. Why would Cain bother with deception when he already has overwhelming force, 40 armed men, against 4 people with 1 wounded? He doesn't need tricks. He's right, Macon said quietly. Man with Cain's resources doesn't need to be subtle. Grace studied Luther's face, reading the truth written in every line and hollow. He was broken inside, hollowed out by 15 years of carrying a secret that poisoned everything it touched. She understood that poison, had carried her own for just as long. I don't forgive you, Grace said finally. What you did letting me run while you stayed silent, that's not something I can just set aside. I don't expect forgiveness. But I understand why you did it. Fear makes people do terrible things, makes them choose silence when they should speak, makes them run when they should stand. She took a breath. I won't reject help when it's offered honestly, no matter how late it comes. Luther's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Grace turned to the others. We need a new plan. Macon, Emma, you take half the herd and go around Devil's Crossing. There's a route through Black Mesa longer but safer. Luther will guide you. What about you? Emma asked, alarm rising in her voice. Josiah, Luther, and I take the other half straight to Devil's Crossing. We draw Cain's attention, make him commit his forces to stopping us. While he's focused on our group, yours makes it through to Cheyenne with enough cattle to pay the debt. That's suicide, Josiah protested. 40 men against 3, 2.5 if we're being honest about my shooting arm. It's tactics, Grace corrected. Cain expects us to try sneaking around or rushing through. He doesn't expect us to split up and sacrifice half to save the other half. It's the only play that makes sense. No, Emma stepped forward, her face set in stubborn lines. We stay together, all of us. Emma, listen to me. No, you listen. Emma's voice strengthened. For 8 months I blamed you for Dad's death. Then yesterday I watched you risk your life to save Josiah. I heard you talk about how much you loved my father, how hard you tried to be the family we needed, even when we pushed you away. Tears started down Emma's face. I'm not losing anyone else. We stay together, or we don't go at all. Grace wanted to argue, to explain the cold mathematics of survival, but looking at Emma's face, seeing the determination and fear and love all mixed together, she understood. This wasn't about tactics anymore. It was about family refusing to abandon each other, even when abandonment might be the smart choice. All right, Grace said quietly. We stay together. Then we need a different plan, Macon said, one that doesn't rely on splitting up. They spent the next hour gathered around a map Luther had brought, sketching terrain and marking positions. The plan that emerged was dangerous, maybe impossible, but it was a plan, and it gave them something better than blind hope. It gave them a chance. As the sun broke through the clouds late in the afternoon, Grace stood apart from the group and looked toward the western horizon. Somewhere beyond those mountains lay Cheyenne's safety, the possibility of finally ending this long flight. But between here and there waited Victor Cain and 40 armed men, a barrier that seemed insurmountable. Luther approached, stopping a respectful distance away. Grace, I know I don't have the right to ask, but I need to know. When this is over, if we survive, will you tell the truth about Silas Clear, your name? Grace was quiet for a long moment. I pulled the trigger, Luther. That's not a lie. Whether he died from the bullet or from you letting him bleed out, I still made the choice to shoot. I still chose violence when maybe there was another way. He was coming at you with a knife. I know, and I'd make the same choice again. But that doesn't erase what I did. She looked at him. I've carried the guilt of taking a life for 15 years. Learning that his death had 2 authors instead of 1 doesn't change the fundamental truth. I shot him intending to kill. The fact that you finished what I started doesn't make me innocent. So you'll keep running, keep hiding. No. Grace shook her head. I'm done running. But I'm also done pretending I'm something I'm not. I'm a woman who killed a man even if it was in self-defense. I'm a woman who hid her past and lied about her name. Those things are true regardless of the circumstances. I'll own them." Luther nodded slowly. "That takes more courage than I've ever had." "Courage is just fear that's decided to stop running," Grace said. "You're here now. You're trying to make amends. That counts for something." As the sun set on the fourth day of their journey, the small group from Iron Ridge Ranch made camp in a defensible position among the rocks. Tomorrow they would reach Devil's Crossing. Tomorrow the real battle would begin. Grace sat watch through the night, her rifle across her knees and her eyes on the darkness. Around her, the others slept fitfully, knowing what waited ahead. Only Macon stayed awake with her, the two of them sharing the quiet companionship of veterans who had both seen too much and somehow survived. "You ever think about what comes after?" Macon asked as midnight passed. "After Cheyenne, after Kane, after all this?" "Sometimes," Grace admitted, "though it's hard to picture." "What would you do if you could do anything?" Grace considered the question. "Maybe open a shooting school. Teach women how to defend themselves. Make sure no one else has to go through what I did, helpless and afraid." "That's a good dream." "What about you?" Macon smiled slightly. "Buy a little cabin somewhere quiet. Spend my days fishing and my nights reading. Maybe get a dog." He looked at his empty sleeve. "Live peaceful for whatever years I got left." "We'll make it happen," Grace said. "We'll survive this and build those futures." "You sound sure." "I have to be. The alternative is unacceptable." They sat in silence as the stars wheeled overhead, two people who had found themselves through violence, hoping to find peace through survival. Tomorrow would bring blood and fire and choices that couldn't be unmade. But tonight there was only the quiet and the stars, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could win against impossible odds. Grace Hollister, who used to be Grace Morgan, who used to be Steady Grace, the dead-eye shooter, sat watch through the darkest hours. Her rifle stayed ready, her eyes stayed sharp, and her heart, that muscle she had tried so hard to protect through years of running and hiding, allowed itself to hope. The woman who couldn't die was about to face her greatest test, and this time she wouldn't face it alone. Grace woke to the sound of her own heartbeat, loud and insistent in the pre-dawn darkness, not from fear, from certainty. Today, one way or another, the running would end. She rose and stepped outside into air so cold it burned her lungs. The stars were fading, giving way to that colorless hour before sunrise when the world held its breath. Grace stood at the edge of their camp, watching the sunrise and thinking about endings. How they came whether you were ready or not, how they shaped everything that came before them, giving meaning or revealing emptiness. Today would bring an ending, one way or another. Devil's Crossing lay 5 miles ahead, a narrow wooden bridge spanning a gorge 100 feet deep. The only route to Cheyenne that wouldn't add 3 days to their journey. Victor Kane knew this. He had 40 men positioned there, Luther's intelligence confirmed. 40 rifles pointed at a bottleneck no herd could avoid. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. 4 people against 40, or 5 if you counted Luther, which Grace did, despite everything. 5 against 40, with 1 wounded crossing terrain that eliminated every advantage except skill. They would need more than skill. They would need miracles. "You're up early." Grace turned to find Emma approaching, wrapped in a blanket against the morning chill. The girl looked older than 17 now, aged by grief and hardship into something harder. But underneath, Grace could still see the child who had lost her father and blamed the nearest target for that loss. "Couldn't sleep," Grace admitted. "Too much thinking. About today. About a lot of things." Grace gestured for Emma to join her. Together they watched the sun climb, painting the landscape in light that made even ugly country beautiful. "Your father proposed to me at sunrise. Did you know that—" Emma shook her head. "We were mending fence on the eastern pasture. He'd been quiet all morning, which wasn't unusual." Thomas was a man comfortable with silence. But this silence felt different, heavy with something unspoken. Grace smiled at the memory. Finally, he just stopped working, set down his tools, and said, "Grace Morgan, I know who you are and what you're running from. I don't care. Marry me and let's build something that matters." "What did you say?" "I said yes before I even thought about it. The words just came out." Grace's smile faded. "Then I cried. First time I'd cried in 7 years. Because someone had looked at all my broken pieces and decided they were worth keeping. Emma was quiet for a moment. I was so angry when he married you. I thought you were taking him away from us, from Mom's memory. Your mother was a good woman, from everything I heard. She was, and she died giving birth to me. Emma's voice caught. Sometimes I wondered if Dad looked at me and saw the person who took her away. Never. Grace turned to face her fully. Your father loved you more than anything in this world. He told me that the first night we talked, said his children were the only perfect things he'd ever been part of creating. Then why marry you instead of just hiring help? The question carried no accusation now, just genuine curiosity. Grace chose her words carefully. Because he was lonely, Emma, not for romance or passion. He'd had that with your mother, but lonely for partnership. For someone to share the burden of running a ranch and raising children, someone who understood that sometimes love is built from work and respect rather than grand gestures. Did he know that you'd learn to love him for real? I think he hoped, but he never demanded it. Grace looked back at the sunrise. That's what made it possible. He gave me space to heal, time to trust, room to become something other than a woman running scared. And somewhere in all that space, love took root. Emma moved closer, close enough that their shoulders touched. I'm sorry I made it so hard for you. After he died, I needed someone to blame. You were convenient. You were grieving. People do cruel things when they're hurt. That doesn't excuse it. Emma took a breath. Grace, if we survive today, if we make it through what's coming, I want to try. Try to be a real family. Try to let you be what Dad wanted you to be. And what's that? Our mother. The word hung between them, fragile and profound. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back. No time for crying, not yet. Maybe not ever, if today went wrong. I'd like that, Grace said quietly. More than you know. They stood together, watching the sun complete its rise, two women bound by grief and hope, and the thin thread of possibility. Behind them, the camp stirred to life. Macon built up the fire. Josiah checked weapons with his good arm. Luther saddled horses with the careful attention of a man who knew this might be his last morning. By the time full light arrived, they were ready. The ride to Devil's Crossing took 2 hours, the cattle moving slow across broken ground. Grace rode point, with Luther, the former student, matching pace with his teacher. Behind them came Macon and Emma, managing the herd. Josiah brought up the rear despite his injury, his jaw set against pain. Nobody spoke. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said around last night's fire. They had made their peace with each other and with whatever ending waited ahead. The gorge appeared first as a dark line across the landscape, a wound in the earth that water and time had carved deep. As they drew closer, the bridge came into view. Wooden planks stretched across empty space, supported by thick beams anchored into rock on both sides, wide enough for a wagon or a line of cattle moving single file. Narrow enough that any mistake meant a 100-foot drop onto rocks that would kill anything that hit them. On the far side of the bridge, Victor Kane sat his horse like a king, surveying his domain. He was alone. No visible guards, no army of riflemen. Just one man on one horse blocking the path forward. Grace raised her hand, halting the column 50 yards from the bridge. Her eyes scanned the terrain, reading the land with the same intensity she once read wind and distance. The gorge walls rose steep on both sides, pocked with boulders and scrub brush. Perfect cover for hidden shooters. It's a trap, Macon said quietly, bringing his horse alongside hers. Obviously, Grace never took her eyes off Kane. The question is, what kind? Luther leaned forward in his saddle, studying the setup. Riflemen in the rocks on both sides, probably 15 on each wall, maybe more. They'll wait until the herd is committed to the bridge, then open fire from above. Box Canyon kill zone. Can we go around? Not with the cattle. Next crossing is 60 miles north. We'd never make Kane's deadline. Grace calculated odds and options, her mind working through scenarios with cold precision. Every choice led to the same conclusion. They were trapped in a situation designed to give them no good options. Surrender or die, trying to cross. Those were the only plays Kane had left them. She chose a third option, making Emma take the herd back half a mile. Keep them bunched and ready. Grace swung down from her saddle, her rifle coming with her. Josiah, you're with them. If shooting starts, you get those cattle moving north and don't look back." "What are you going to do?" Emma asked, fear plain in her voice. "Talk to Victor Kane." Grace checked her Winchester, making sure the action was smooth and the magazine full. "See if we can end this without more bloodshed." "That's suicide," Josiah protested. "He's got 40 men hidden in those rocks." "Then they'll shoot a woman walking under flag of truce." Grace's voice was flat. "That would look bad when the territorial marshal investigates. Kane's smart enough to avoid that kind of attention." "I'm coming with you," Luther said. It wasn't a question. Grace started to refuse, then saw the look in his eyes. Luther Payne needed this, needed to stand beside her after 15 years of standing aside. She understood that need in her bones. "All right," Grace agreed, "but you follow my lead, no matter what happens." They walked forward together, two figures crossing open ground toward a trap they could see but couldn't avoid. Grace carried her rifle low and ready, not aimed but instantly accessible. Luther kept his hands visible and empty, making no move toward the pistols at his hips. Victor Kane watched them approach, his expression unreadable. As they drew within speaking distance, he dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent his life on horseback. He wore good clothes, expensive clothes. Everything about him spoke of wealth and power and the absolute confidence that came from never being told no. "Mrs. Hollister," Kane said, touching his hat brim in mockery of courtesy. "Or should I say, Mrs. Morgan, I'm never quite sure which name you prefer." "Grace will do," she replied evenly. "Names are just sounds we make to identify ourselves. They don't change who we are underneath." "Philosophical this morning. I like that." Kane glanced at Luther. "Mr. Payne, I'm surprised to see you here. When you didn't return to camp, I assumed you'd simply run. Cowardice seems to be your defining trait." Luther's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Grace stepped forward slightly, drawing Kane's attention back to her. "You've set quite the welcome party. 40 guns for one woman and a handful of cattle. I'm flattered. I learned not to underestimate you after Widow's Canyon." Kane smiled without warmth. 8 of my best men humiliated by one rifle. You're everything the legends say, Grace, maybe more." "The legends are just stories. I'm just a woman trying to get her cattle to market." "No," Kane shook his head. "You're much more than that. You're the woman who's been haunting my thoughts for 15 years. The statement hung in the air between them. Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had expected many things from this confrontation, but not this. "I don't know what you mean," she said carefully. "Don't you?" Kane moved closer, his movements deliberate and controlled. 15 years ago, I was a Pinkerton detective investigating the death of Silas Garrett. Routine case or so, I thought. Rich man killed by his employee, wanted poster issued, suspect fled. Simple work." He paused, his eyes never leaving Grace's face. "But then I started digging deeper, talked to people who knew Garrett, people who worked the Wild West show. Every single person told me the same story. Silas Garrett was a monster who beat the most talented sharpshooter in America. Beat her until she couldn't perform. Beat her because he could." Grace's grip tightened on her rifle. "I found medical records," Kane continued. "Broken ribs, fractured arm burns. All documented by show doctors who were too afraid of Garrett to report it. I found witnesses who heard your screams at night when he was particularly drunk and violent. I built a case that would have proven self-defense beyond any doubt." "Then why didn't you close it?" Grace asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. "Because I went to see you perform first, one last time before I filed my report." Kane's voice took on a different quality, something almost reverent. "You were magnificent, Grace. Absolutely magnificent. The way you moved, the precision of every shot, the quiet confidence. I'd never seen anything like it." He took another step closer. Grace held her ground. "I fell in love with you that night," Kane said simply. "Fell in love with a woman I'd never met, who was wanted for murder, who had vanished into the frontier like smoke. I knew it was insane, knew it was obsessive, but I couldn't help it." "So you buried the evidence," Grace said, understanding dawning. "You let the warrant stand so I'd stay wanted, so I'd stay running and afraid. I told myself I was protecting you, that if I cleared your name, Garrett's family would come after you with private detectives and hired guns, that keeping you wanted actually kept you safe." Kane's expression twisted into something between shame and defiance. "But the truth is simpler. I wanted you to need protection, need safety, need me." Luther made a sound of disgust. Kane ignored him. "For 15 years I searched," Kane continued, "built my empire while my agents scoured the territories for any trace of Grace Morgan. And then, almost by accident, I found you. Married to a rancher in Wyoming, living under a false name, trying to be someone ordinary." "Thomas," Grace said quietly, "you killed him." "I offered him money first, generous money. He refused, said his wife wasn't for sale at any price." And Kane's voice hardened. "So I showed him who you really were, gave him proof, told him that if he didn't sell and leave, I'd have you arrested and hanged for murder. And he still refused. He said, 'I know who my wife is, I know what she's running from, and I know she's worth more than all your money and threats combined. Get off my land.'" Kane paused. "So I had his wagon brake lines cut, made it look like an accident, cleared the way for what came next." The casual admission of murder should have shocked Grace. Instead, she felt only a cold, settled certainty. She had known. Deep down, she had always known that Thomas's death was no accident. "You killed a good man," Grace said. "The best man I ever knew. And for what? So you could force me to marry you, to own me like property. To save you," Kane insisted. "Don't you understand, Grace? I've spent 15 years building the power to protect you, to give you safety and security, to make you mine in a way that no one could challenge or threaten. This isn't about ownership, it's about love. Love doesn't murder," Grace's voice cut like steel. "Love doesn't manipulate and threaten and destroy. What you feel isn't love, Victor. It's obsession. It's sickness. Call it what you want." Kane's hand moved toward his gun. "But it ends here today. You'll marry me and this all goes away. The debt, the threats, everything. Or you'll die trying to cross that bridge. Those are your only options." "No," Grace said quietly. "There's a third option." She raised her rifle. The world exploded into violence. 40 rifles opened fire from the gorge walls, muzzle flashes sparking from behind rocks and brush. Bullets tore through the air where Grace and Luther had been standing, but they were already moving. Grace rolled left. Luther dove right, both finding cover behind boulders as lead chewed the ground around them. Behind them, back at the herd, Macon opened fire toward the western wall. His rifle barked steady and precise, each shot forcing a hidden gunman to duck or relocate. Emma had her pistol out, firing toward the eastern side with more courage than accuracy. Grace came up from her role already aiming. The Winchester had become an extension of her will, each shot flowing into the next without conscious thought. A rifleman spun as lead found his shoulder. A gun stock exploded into splinters. A canteen burst in a spray of water, the sudden drenching making its owner lose footing and tumble down the rocky slope. She didn't count anymore. Didn't need to. Her body knew how many rounds remained, knew when to reload, knew where the next threat would emerge before it appeared. Luther had his pistols out now, firing with both hands in a display of ambidextrous skill that would have been impressive if it wasn't so desperate. He laid down covering fire while Grace reloaded, then Grace covered him while he did the same. They worked together like they had trained for years, each anticipating the other's movements. But they were still only 2 people against 40. The math didn't work, couldn't work. Josiah appeared suddenly riding hard despite his wounded shoulder. He came straight through the kill zone bullets, kicking up dirt around his horse's hooves. In his good hand, he carried a lit stick of dynamite, the fuse burning short and fast. "Get down!" he screamed. Josiah threw the dynamite toward the eastern wall where the largest concentration of gunmen had taken position. The stick arced through the air, tumbling end over end in awful slow motion. It hit the rocks and bounced once before detonating. The explosion was massive, far larger than one stick should have produced. Josiah must have bundled multiple sticks together, creating a bomb rather than a grenade. Rock and earth erupted outward, the concussion wave rolling across the gorge like thunder made solid. Men screamed. The cliff face cracked and shifted. Several boulders the size of wagons broke loose and tumbled down, crushing everything in their path. The eastern side collapsed into chaos and dust. But the western side still held firm, and 15 rifles still pointed toward the small group trying to cross. Luther saw it happening, saw the gunmen on the western wall shifting their aim toward Josiah, who sat exposed on his panicked horse. Saw the fingers tightening on triggers, the barrels lining up for shots that couldn't miss. He made his choice. Luther Payne ran into the open, sprinting toward Josiah while firing both pistols at the western wall. Every shot screamed for attention, forced the hidden rifleman to notice him instead of the boy. He became the biggest threat, the most immediate target. The bullets found him. First one caught Luther in the side, spinning him halfway around, but not dropping him. Second hit his leg, shattering bone and sending him to his knees. Third and fourth and fifth struck in rapid succession, punching through cloth and flesh with wet final sounds. Luther fell. Grace screamed his name, a sound torn from somewhere, deep and primal. She ran to him, heedless of the bullets still flying, and dragged him behind cover. His blood soaked her hands, her clothes pooled on the ground beneath him. "Luther! No, no, no!" Grace pressed her hands against the wounds, but there were too many. Blood welled between her fingers, hot and unstoppable. Luther looked up at her, his eyes already glazing. "Did he make it, the boy?" Grace glanced over the boulder. Josiah was riding back toward the herd, hunched low over his horse's neck, but alive. "He made it. He's safe." "Good." Luther coughed, blood speckling his lips. "That's good. One right choice. Finally." His hand groped for hers, found it held tight. "Grace, I'm sorry. For all of it. For being a coward when you needed courage. For staying silent when I should have spoken. For wasting 15 years when I could have helped you." "You helped me now," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "You saved Josiah. That matters. That counts. Tell him—" Luther's voice was fading, each word requiring monumental effort. "Tell the boy I'm sorry I couldn't help his father, but I helped him. Tell him that means something." "I'll tell him," Grace promised. "I swear it." Luther smiled, the expression peaceful and almost happy. "Feels good. Doing the right thing. Should have tried it sooner." His eyes found the sky above them, blue and endless. Beautiful day to die. His hand went slack in hers. The light left his eyes. Luther Payne, who had spent 15 years running from his own cowardice, died standing in the way of bullets meant for someone else. Grace closed his eyes gently, then laid him down with care. Something inside her cracked. Not broke, but transformed. Grief and rage mixing into something cold and crystalline and absolutely focused. She picked up Luther's pistols, checked the loads. Both had rounds remaining. She added them to her own weapons, now carrying enough firepower for a small war. When she stood, her face was carved from stone, and her eyes held the kind of certainty that came from having nothing left to lose. The remaining gunmen on the western wall had stopped firing, confused by the sudden lull. Kane stood at the bridge entrance, his own gun drawn now, watching Grace with something between fear and fascination. Grace walked toward him. Bullets kicked up dirt around her boots, but she didn't flinch, didn't dodge. She simply walked forward with mechanical precision, her weapons ready but not raised. Behind her, Macon and Emma and Josiah laid down, covering fire, keeping the Western rifleman pinned. In front of her, Kane stood frozen, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed possible. Grace stopped 10 feet from him. "You killed Thomas," she said quietly. "You killed a good man because he stood between you and what you wanted. You killed Luther because he chose courage over cowardice. How many more people have to die to feed your obsession?" "As many as it takes," Kane replied, his gun pointed at her chest. "I've built an empire on doing what's necessary. One more body won't change anything." "No, it won't. But it will end this." Grace's hands hovered near her weapons. "You want me, Victor? Then take your shot. Kill me yourself instead of hiding behind hired guns. Prove your love is strong enough to pull the trigger." Kane's hand trembled slightly. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "You think I won't?" he asked. "I think you've spent 15 years telling yourself a story about saving me, about protecting me, about love." Grace took one step closer. "But love doesn't hide evidence, doesn't bury truth, doesn't murder the people I care about. You're not a savior, Victor. You're just another Silas Garrett in expensive clothes. I'm nothing like him. Aren't you? He controlled me through violence. You control through manipulation and money. He beat me when I didn't obey. You kill the people I love when they stand in your way." Grace's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The methods are different, but the result is the same. You want to own me, body and soul. That's not love. That's possession." Kane's finger tightened on the trigger. For a long moment, everything hung suspended. The morning sun, the distant sounds of the herd, the bodies of good men lying in the dust. All of it balanced on the edge of a decision one man had to make. "I could have been different," Kane said finally. "If you'd just given me a chance 15 years ago, if you'd let me save you properly." "I didn't need saving," Grace replied. "I needed justice. I needed truth. I needed someone to stand up and testify that Silas Garrett was a monster who got what he deserved. But you chose silence. Chose to keep me running so I'd be vulnerable enough to need you someday." She reached into her coat pocket slowly, giving Kane time to see the movement wasn't a threat. She withdrew an envelope official looking and sealed. "3 days ago, I sent a letter to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne," Grace said. "Along with every piece of evidence Thomas collected about your crimes. Arson, murder, extortion, corruption, all of it documented and witnessed and ready for court. You're lying. I also included my own testimony about my real identity, about Silas Garrett and what happened that night, about Luther's role in letting him die." Grace held up the envelope. "This is a copy of everything I sent. You can read it if you want. See how thorough Thomas was in building his case." Kane's face went pale. "If you expose yourself, you'll hang for murder." "Maybe. But Judge Morrison is fair. He'll hear the full story, read Luther's confession, consider the circumstances." Grace's voice steadied. "More importantly, he'll see what you've done. And no amount of money or influence will save you from federal charges of murder and conspiracy. You'd sacrifice yourself just to destroy me?" "No." Grace shook her head. "I'd sacrifice myself to save Emma and Josiah, to protect Iron Ridge, to make sure Thomas's death meant something. You're just the obstacle that happens to be in the way." Kane stared at her, seeing clearly, for perhaps the first time, the woman behind the legend. Not the fantasy he'd built in his mind, but the real person. Broken and scarred and absolutely unbreakable. "I loved you," he said, the words pathetic and small. "No," Grace replied. "You loved an idea of me, a woman who needed you, a woman you could shape and control and save. But I was never that woman, not even when I was running scared." Kane's hand suddenly moved, drawing a small derringer from inside his coat. The hidden weapon came up fast, pointed directly at Grace's heart. "If I can't have you," Kane said, his voice breaking, "then no one will." Grace stood frozen, her rifle too low to bring up in time. Macon was too far. Luther was dead. Time seemed to slow as Kane's finger tightened on the trigger. Then Emma was there. The girl stepped between them, arms spread wide, her body shielding Grace completely. "No," Emma said, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. "You want to kill her, you kill me first. That's what family does. We stand between the people we love and the bullets meant for them." Kane stared at her, the derringer wavering. For all his obsession, for all his crimes, he had never intended to murder a 17-year-old girl. His hand began to shake. "Emma, get back," Grace whispered urgently. "No," Emma replied without turning. "Not this time. Not ever again." The moment of hesitation was enough. Macon's rifle cracked from 30 yards away, the shot precise and perfect. The derringer flew from Kane's hand, his fingers suddenly empty and bleeding from where the bullet had grazed them. The sound of horses approaching made them both turn. From the north, a column of riders appeared. 20 men wearing federal badges led by a stern-faced marshal who looked like he'd seen every kind of evil humanity could produce and wasn't impressed by any of it. Marshal Daniel Wright reined in his horse and surveyed the scene. Bodies in the dust, wounded men crying for help, blood and smoke, and the wreckage of violence. "Victor Kane," Wright said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, corruption of public officials, and about 15 other charges I'll detail when we get to Cheyenne. Step away from your weapon." Kane looked at the marshal, then at Grace, then at the gun in his hand. His finger tightened on the trigger. One shot. That's all it would take. "Do it," Grace said quietly. "Prove your love is strong enough to destroy what you claim to cherish." The words hit Kane like a physical blow. His hand began to shake. Because she was right. 15 years of obsession, 15 years of building an empire for the sole purpose of being worthy of Grace Morgan. And it all came down to this moment. If he pulled the trigger, he would have nothing. The woman he claimed to love would be dead by his hand. The empire would be forfeit to the law. 15 years would mean nothing but a monument to madness. If he lowered the gun, he lost everything anyway. But at least Grace would live. At least somewhere in the world the woman he had loved from afar would keep breathing, keep fighting, keep being the magnificent force of nature he had fallen for all those years ago. It wasn't really a choice at all. Kane's hand opened. The gun fell, hitting the ground with a dull thud that sounded like the closing of a book. "I loved you," he whispered, as Marshal Wright's men moved in to restrain him. "I really did love you." "No," Grace replied, her voice carrying hard-won wisdom. "You loved the idea of owning me. You loved the obsession itself more than the person at its center. That was never love, Victor. That was just another kind of cage." She turned away as they led him toward the waiting horses, his hands bound, and his empire in ruins. "Grace," Kane called out, his voice breaking, "in another life could we have—" "No," Grace interrupted without turning back. "In any life I would have chosen freedom over your golden cage. Some women are meant to be wild. You can't love wildness and try to tame it at the same time." They took Kane away, his hands bound and his empire crumbling. His hired guns surrendered without resistance. 40 men who had been willing to kill for money, but not willing to die for someone else's obsession. Within an hour the gorge was cleared and the bridge stood open. Grace stood over Luther's body, looking down at the man who had finally found courage at the cost of his life. Josiah and Emma joined her, the three of them silent in their grief. "He saved my life," Josiah said quietly. "Took those bullets that were meant for me." "He did," Grace agreed. After 15 years of running from the choice he made that night with Silas Garrett, he finally made a choice he could live with, or die with. "Was he a good man?" Emma asked. Grace considered the question. "He was a man who made terrible choices out of fear and spent the rest of his life trying to atone for them. I don't know if that makes him good, but it makes him human. And in the end he chose right when it mattered most." They buried Luther Payne on a hill overlooking Devil's Crossing, marking the grave with stones and a simple wooden cross. Grace spoke words over him that she hoped carried wherever souls went when bodies failed. "You were a coward once, Luther Payne, but you died a hero. May that be what defines you in whatever comes next." 2 days later in Cheyenne, Judge Morrison called Grace to his private office. The territorial judge was a man in his 60s with sharp eyes that had seen every variety of human nature and remained unimpressed by most of it. "Mrs. Hollister," he said, gesturing to a chair, "or should I say Mrs. Morgan, I've been reviewing the evidence in your case." Grace sat, her heart beating faster despite her attempt at calm. "And Luther Payne left a written confession before he died, very thorough, very detailed." Morrison slid a document across his desk. "Combined with the medical records from the Wild West show witness statements and the pattern of abuse documented by multiple sources. I'm ruling that Silas Garrett's death was justifiable self-defense." He produced another paper official and stamped with territorial seals. "This is a full pardon. The warrant for Grace Morgan has been withdrawn. You're free to use your real name without fear of prosecution." Grace took the document with trembling hands. After 15 years, freedom reduced to ink on paper. "There's one more matter," Morrison continued. "Victor Kane's assets are being liquidated to pay restitution to his victims. Given that he murdered your husband and attempted to murder you, the territorial court has awarded you compensation." He named a figure that made Grace's breath stop. $200,000. The number was incomprehensible. A fortune that could rebuild Iron Ridge 10 times over, secure Emma and Josiah's futures fund, the shooting school she'd dreamed of opening. "Blood money," Grace said quietly. "Justice money," Morrison corrected firmly. "Kane built his empire on the suffering of good people. Let something good come from its ashes. Take the money, build something that honors your husband's memory and helps others the way you wish someone had helped you." Grace looked down at the pardon in her hands, then up at the stern judge who had chosen to see justice instead of just law. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite contain. "Don't thank me. Thank the people who stood with you when it mattered. That's what saved you. Not the law, not justice. Family." 3 months later, Iron Ridge Ranch stood rebuilt and stronger than before. The cattle sale had brought enough money to pay every debt and fund improvements that Thomas Tate had dreamed about but never had resources to attempt. New fences, a repaired barn, breeding stock that would improve the herd for generations. Grace stood on the porch in the morning light, watching Emma and Josiah work with the horses in the corral. The wound in Josiah's shoulder had healed clean, leaving only a scar and a story. Emma had grown into her role managing the ranch operations, showing a head for business that surprised everyone, including herself. They were healing. All of them. Not forgetting healing was different from forgetting, but learning to carry their losses without being crushed by the weight. Grace. She turned to find Emma climbing the porch steps, her face flushed from exertion and smiling in a way she hadn't smiled in months. "We got the breeding contracts finalized," Emma said, waving papers. 3 ranches want to use our bull for their herds. That's steady income for the next 2 years at least. "Your father would be proud," Grace said. "He always knew quality breeding was the future." "Our father," Emma corrected gently, "and he'd be proud of you too, for everything you did, everything you survived." Grace felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the one that came whenever Emma bridged the gap between stepmother and mother. They had been working on it, slowly building something real from the broken pieces of grief and suspicion. "I need to visit the hill," Grace said. "You want to come?" They rode together to the spot where they had buried Luther, where a simple marker stood against the sky. Someone had planted wildflowers around the grave, probably Josiah, though he never admitted it. Grace knelt and placed fresh flowers beside the wooden cross. "I told the marshal everything, like I promised. Luther's confession, what really happened that night with Silas. Judge Morrison reviewed all the evidence." "What did he decide?" Emma asked. "Ruled that Silas Garrett's death was self-defense, and that Luther's choice not to seek medical help, while ethically questionable, didn't constitute murder under territorial law." Grace stood brushing dirt from her knees. "The warrant for Grace Morgan has been withdrawn. I'm officially cleared." "So you're free." "I'm free," Grace agreed. "After 15 years of running, I can finally use my real name without fear." "Will you?" Emma asked. "Go back to being Grace Morgan." Grace considered the question. "No, I think I'll stay Grace Hollister. That's who I became here, who Thomas helped me become. Changing back would feel like erasing all the good years." "Mom," Emma said softly, testing the word. "I want to try calling you that, if it's okay." Grace turned to look at the girl who had hated her, blamed her, and finally chosen to trust her. "I would like that very much." They embraced on the hilltop while the Wyoming wind blew around them, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. Below Iron Ridge Ranch stretched across the valley, a testament to survival and stubborn refusal to surrender. Grace Hollister had spent 15 years running from her past, had married for safety, hidden her true self, lived in constant fear of discovery. But through violence and loss and the terrible choices forced on people who refused to give up, she had found something she never expected. She had found home. And sometimes Grace thought, as she held Emma close and looked at the land she had fought to keep home, was worth any price, even the blood it cost to claim it.